I am really, really happy to be able to welcome Joe Glauber to present for the Research Roundtable about something that is just in the news and wanting to be sure that the ANH community had a chance to hear from, really the world's expert on this question of how the closure of the Strait of Hormuz, is affecting especially African, especially South Asian, but also worldwide farmers through this spike in fertilizer prices. You'll see a lot of data. We'll have a chance to talk about it. And if we're really lucky, we'll have an update on how this plays out, because as you'll see, there's a lot of uncertainty. So Joe, really keen to hear from you. And people can enter in the chat, but I think the main thing will be discussion.
Yeah.
Take notes on the points, and then we'll come around to thinking about how this affects different people's research questions.
Okay, great. So I can just start advancing, right? And just
Yep,
confirm that it's advancing for me. It is.
works great. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, great. Um, well, no, thanks very much. And I expect this was all in my bio, but I've been at IFPRI for the last 11, 12 years or so. And part of that, I was at USDA where I ran the U.S. government sort of agricultural supply demand estimates group. And so I've been at this sort of analyzing markets for a long, long time. But really, it wasn't my career at IFPRI. I was doing research for the first few years. It wasn't until the COVID and then followed by the Russia's invasion of Ukraine that I started getting back into more kind of what's going on with agricultural markets. Just because I realized there was a bit of a gap in our own research, in that we were getting a lot of questions, but we didn't really have people that were actively following markets. So yes, if you wanted some work on some model work on what a policy would be or whatever, that we had great resources there. But kind of looking at the day-to-day stuff, I realized that, hey, that's what I used to do. I could do that again pretty easily, and so I did that with Ukraine, but that sort of just morphed into other market issues. So you might remember in 2023, we had India had a big export ban on rice, that affected about 50% of their exports. India is a big player in global rice export and global rice trade. They account for about 40% of trade. So a big impact. And so we were able to kind of trace those impacts down to, say, West Africa or other areas that were importing, heavily dependent on India for rice supplies. And then again, I actually went into an emeritus position with IFPRI a year or two ago, and but have just kind of continued with this. And this most recent thing is fairly significant. You look at I mean, it's been in the news obviously for the last 4 months now, or 3.5 months, but for good reason, in the sense that it's the Strait of Hormuz accounts for so much of the world oil exports, so much of the things like liquefied natural gas, which is important for fertilizer production. And then, a lot of particular of fertilizer components as well, nitrogen products like urea and other nitrogen fertilizers, phosphate fertilizers. They're all very, very important. Nitrogen, probably around 35%, 40% of nitrogen fertilizers comes out of the Strait of Hormuz. I might add, it's a very evolving, or that's evolved over the last 20 years. They were very minor, but I think they realized that with all the natural gas production in the region, they could rather than burning it off for other things, they started converting it into nitrogen fertilizers and became a huge supplier for the world. They're also a very big supplier of sulfur, sulfur is used in phosphate fertilizer production. So it's not a fertilizer itself, but countries like India or Morocco will import sulfur, and then combine in processes to make products like diammonium phosphate, so-called DAP. And what's happened, of course, is with the closure after the U.S. and Israeli attacks on Iran, The strait has been effectively closed, and we see about 90% decline in shipping since the attacks began. Immediately, we've seen these big price increases. I have some of the other. I have a long time series on these prices, largely because I'm interested later in this presentation to kind of compare the current crisis to previous food price crises that we've had. But you can see that, particularly for fertilizer and energy prices, these are spikes, very high spikes over the last several months, still below 2022 levels. Again, that could change, but if you look at things like petrol prices or diesel prices sort of at the retail level, they're high, but not quite as high as they were a few years ago. And interesting is that the crop price movements have not followed. And for most of these other crises, we saw immediate reactions in for crops like wheat and corn and rice and soybeans and other things. There are some exceptions, and I'll show you on the next chart where this just shows a variety of the energy and fertilizer prices just over the last. Again, this is World Bank data looking at monthly averages. And I might add for some of these agricultural commodities, the prices are lower now than they were in May. So the actual increases are less than shown on this chart. But you can see that, yeah, all the energy products are pretty high. Liquefied natural gas, again, the Gulf produces about 20% of the LNG exports in the world. Natural gas prices are globally are low, or haven't increased nearly as much, and that's largely because the U.S. Our market is a little different. Natural gas, you apart from liquefied natural gas, you can't really export it other than via pipeline, and so there are some big disconnects between natural gas prices in Europe or the Middle East and what we're seeing, say, in the Gulf, in the U.S. But again, they're still high, 20% or 17-20% increase for natural gas is certainly been quite high. And then if you translate that over into the fertilizer prices, urea in particular has been is one. Urea is probably the most common nitrogen-based fertilizer that's actively traded and exported. It the Mideast accounts for a lot of that production or exports, around 35-40% or so. Phosphate fertilizers, I have DAP here, that's up around 20%. And again, those prices have been boosted. Urea prices actually have come down over the last few weeks, again, because of things like natural gas production in the U.S., and particularly urea prices in the U.S. have fallen. But again, still quite high. But then you get over to the commodity prices, and you can see that apart from hard red winter wheat, which is largely affected, that hard red winter wheat in the U.S. is largely a southern plains, is largely grown in the southern plains of the U.S. We have a very bad drought going on in that area right now, and so hard red winter prices have been up considerably. Soft red winter, the other major wheat, one of the other major wheats in the U.S., those haven't risen nearly as much. And if you go to Europe and other large wheat producing regions, those wheat prices are more only about 5% above what they were 4 months ago. And so, rice prices, Thai prices have been a little higher than some others, but only about 5%. And again, price movements over the last couple of weeks, they've actually fallen a little bit. The big exception is vegetable oil, and vegetable oil largely because of this nexus with biodiesel production. We have seen vegetable oil prices, because vegetable oils are used as a feedstock into biodiesel production. Those with diesel prices going up, so too have biodiesel prices increased. And so we have seen a direct link to pulling up vegetable oil prices. And so that's been a concern. I think that over the longer run, well, I'll get into this, but some of that, the connection with biofuels is concerning over the longer run, but in the short run, at least, we're seeing a direct impact on vegetable oil prices. So the other big thing is price volatility, and I just show so you can calculate price volatility a lot of ways. People will do it just by looking at historical prices and movements. The measure I'm using is something taken from the futures market. So every day you can calculate, there's a way of calculating essentially a forward-looking volatility measure called implied volatility. And these are pretty good measures of ex ante, that is forward-looking measures of price volatility. And what I've done here is taken the last 10 years for each day and kind of put those in a range, ranges them with the high and the low, and then taken a 10-year average. And then the red lines are just the current volatilities that we're seeing in both wheat and maize markets. And wheats, both those things, if you look at the high end of the range, that's 2022 for the most part. And there are a couple of those observations towards the end of the year, probably maybe another year, but it's largely 2022 where we saw record high volatilities. And that, remember, that's when Russia invaded Ukraine. Ukraine and Russia accounted for, almost a third of global wheat exports, about 20% of global maize exports, a lot of vegetable oils in the form of sunflower oil. So there was a lot of volatility in the global markets back in 2022. We don't see that right now. And if you see, even over the last several weeks, the price volatility actually has not only been down below the 10-year average, it's been closer to the floor of the distribution, which is interesting, because what it's saying is the market doesn't consider the uncertainty in these these grain markets nearly like it was looking at the situation back in 2022, which again is consistent enough with the fact that we haven't seen the big run up in grain prices either. So I want to try to square those as we move forward, and why these things might be different than 2022, or indeed if you go back to 2007-8 or 2010-11, some of those periods where we saw again, previous periods of food price volatility. So I put out a piece with Shauna Rita, who's a professor at North Dakota State, and we looked at, so we said, well, gee, how different is this current crisis to the other crises and that we've seen over the last 25 years or so. And I think one thing that is really distinctive is this is largely supply side shocks. So we're seeing it on inputs primarily, both energy and fertilizer, not on the sort of classic demand shocks that we saw in a lot of these other global crises. So if you look at biofuels, if you look at China, in the past, these were all really big for various of these crises. These were big issues and had big impacts on the price shocks at the time. They're largely absent right now. It doesn't mean that they won't come later, but for the time being, they're largely absent. Now, it is true that for these other food price crises did have a lot of supply shocks as well. We had droughts in 2007-8. I think Australia had 3 years in a row of reduced wheat crops, which had really brought down wheat stocks when when the prices really started getting high in 2007-8. And then again, 2010-12, we had this La Nina event, these La Nina events back to back that had really affected yields around the world. And then COVID as well. We had some issues. So, and I might add, we are looking at a strengthening El Nino, which could have impacts, particularly in Southern Africa, but also in areas like Australia or Southeast Asia for rice production. Still a long ways off from that El Nino developing, but the probabilities have been increasing month to month that this will be a strong El Nino, and that those are normally associated with, at least for the regions I just mentioned, with drier conditions, and so that remains to be seen. But on top of that, what we've seen in almost every one of these events are policy actions that have exacerbated price movements. So primarily export restrictions, and I think particularly on commodities like on wheat. But right now we're seeing some on things like nitrogen fertilizer exports or phosphate fertilizer exports, where we have countries that have put in restrictions, and these are understandable reactions in the sense of countries are concerned about having ample inputs for their own farmers, but the problem with that, particularly if they are typically a large exporter like China or some other countries, to have when they
I just lost Joe, but he'll come back.
Yeah, hopefully.
While we're waiting for him to come back, note we will have a roundtable on the El Nino forecasts and how those will impact evolving El Nino.
Next week at the same time.
Again, but for the most part, most of it is restricted to just what the reactions are because of the closure of the Strait of Hormuz. And again,
I'll let Joe know that we've lost him. Oh shoot! Now we've lost him entirely. Ah, Joe, you're muted. I can share your slides from my end if you want.
And
Is that better?
You're still muted,
You're
Joe.
still muted. You're still muted. Just your mute button is still. It's those screens at the multiple screens at the office are.
It's okay. We're just building suspense for the second half of Joe's presentation.
all right, guys, can you see me, hear me?
Indeed, yes.
Touch me, heal me. Good.
There you go.
You can't hear me, right? Great.
Yeah.
Yes, that works.
All right. Apologize. And what about, I've lost the screen though. Is that correct? No, I'm back up. We're good?
No, we don't see the shared screen. And just so you know, the last thing
Hello?
can you hear us? You can't hear me. Can you hear now? Still not.
Jesus.
How
Hello?
about if
Anybody hear me?
Yeah. Can you hear us, Joe?
No. We can hear him. Let me just say.
Hey, Will, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
I can't hear you guys at all.
We can hear.
Okay, I'm sorry. I can hear you now, but do you have my screen? That's the main thing. Okay.
No.
All right.
Joe, I can just pull up the presentation if you like.
Yeah, look, I think I've turned off all the other all my other monitors are snapped back on. Okay, great.
Yeah, I just
if you
have
could do that.
screen,
I apologize.
So,
this is all using a lot of other people's equipment right now,
It is
and I don't
totally
know what they
fine.
have set up here.
I think we
So
were on this slide, right?
no,
Yeah.
move to the next one.
Okay.
Yeah,
But
so
the last thing, Joe, just so you know, the last thing we heard was the bottom point on the previous slide on the bottom left. You were saying that
yeah,
the current crisis is just the closure,
yeah,
not the policy responses and the stockouts.
yeah, that's correct. So let's move to the next slide. And I wanted to talk just briefly about biofuels because I think what 2007-8 was really driven in large part by the huge expansion of ethanol in the U.S. and it was adding 1 billion gallons a year, ramped up, where there was almost no corn. That on top of what was going on in the wheat markets with the droughts that I mentioned really saw this big increase. For the rest of the time, we've seen a pretty gradual ethanol use in the U.S. has pretty much flattened. It has grown in other areas of the world like Brazil and India and others are using ethanol, but the increases haven't been sharp. The biodiesel, very similar. We've seen a big ramp up in biodiesel production in the U.S., but it's been fairly gradual. So we have certainly vegetable oil prices. I think some of the rise is certainly can be attributed to that, but it's not like the ethanol boom was in 2007-8. We just haven't seen that. But a lot of troubling things there. If you look at almost any statement out of countries like the Indonesia or Brazil or the U.S. Among a lot of the biofuel advocates, is that because of high uh, petroleum prices, we need to sort of
Darn. That's too bad. Joe, we have lost. I don't think he can hear us.
I'll put something in
Um,
the chat or maybe just send him a text.
yeah,
It might be easier.
but while we're just looking at this, it's really amazing how that sharp. Hey, Joe, can you hear? You're muted, but you're muted, so we don't hear you. But we can see your mouse. But you're muted, so we don't hear you. I think he cannot hear us. We can't hear you.
that
Oh,
should
now we
do
can.
it.
Think
Yeah,
you're back.
so sorry. I have no idea what's going on. The mouse just starts moving. And I think what happened is I'm on a relatively uh, unstable connection or something here that bounces me out of Zoom for a minute and then everything goes. Okay, next slide. All right. So the other big factor has been China, and China, China had this 10% per year annual growth or 15% annual growth rates. I mean, just incredible in terms of soybean imports. Yet really over the last 5-10 years, it's been a much smaller growth rate. They've actually declined over the last couple of years on the feed grains. That's been more of a temporary situation as well. We saw this big increase following the outbreak of African swine fever, and because of that, we had
This is really too bad.
Yeah.
Um, if folks are not familiar, ASF is referring to the African swine fever that decimated hog numbers. I don't recall what year the African swine fever epidemic in China was, but
Okay, try it again.
And
Next
Joe, I am
slide. Yeah.
mindful of your need to get this resolved for your back-to-back calls after this. So let us know if you need to stop before the hour in order
No,
to
you just
reboot
tell
or.
me how I'm doing. I'm way
Okay.
over time, I know, but let's move on to the next slide. Let me try to move through these things without cutting out. Um, yeah. So the other big thing right now is we're really looking at fairly good crop conditions around the world. So that's the good news. That that uh, yeah, if you can go back, great.
Yeah.
That that really, apart from the southern plains where we see some bad, real dryness that's affected hard red winter wheat production, rest of the world is looking pretty good. And we have relatively abundant stocks for most of the major crops. And that, I think these are the real factors that are playing into why we haven't seen the big increases in commodity prices or agricultural crop prices like we have for other things. Okay, let's get, because the bigger question then is, okay, but what about fertilizer use? Because fertilizer prices are up. How's this going to affect farms? Next slide. So this just gives you an idea of nitrogen use around the world. And again, nitrogen is very important in parts of Africa, particularly Southern Africa, along East Africa. A lot of the rest of Africa is fairly low use, but imports are very important, and particularly imports from the Persian Gulf. And so it's sort of, yes, many countries in sub-Saharan Africa don't fertilize to the same degree as, say, a Brazil or an India or the US or Australia, but they are very dependent on almost 100% dependency in many cases on imports. And in this case, a lot of those imports are coming out of the Gulf. So there's a lot of concern. Next slide. Yeah, and so this just gives you some notion of some of the other players in the global market for fertilizer. Unfortunately, Russia's actually has stepped up urea exports this year in 2026, even above what they were in 2025. That's good news. So they've been exporting a lot. China, on the other hand, has had export restrictions in place. Now, the word is China will increase export or resume exporting nitrogen fertilizers in the coming months, and that potentially by the fall, increasing phosphate fertilizer. But these are the big players in the world. And that's where the world's looking right now to find additional supplies of urea and things like DAP and ammonia and other fertilizer components. Next slide. So the real question is, what are we going to see on the global side? And let me focus first on the global, and then we can talk more specifically about Africa. But if you look at what happened in 2022, remember in 2022 we had record high fertilizer prices, and that was for all the three of the major fertilizer ingredients. Nitrogen prices were records, phosphate prices, potassium, potash were all up considerably. But and you can look at the aggregates rates that at least estimated by FAO. They were down. Now these are the quality of the data are not great. I mean, these are essentially estimates on total nitrogen use divided by total cropland. So we're not talking about maize. We're not talking about, a particular vegetable crop or whatever that may have a much higher fertilizer rate, in which case you would think that with higher prices, or if you're going to cut back on fertilizer, you may keep it with the crops that have that at least promise the biggest return. But what we're seeing is some nitrogen use down about 3%, phosphate use and potassium use again down 7 to 10%, and I think that makes sense in the sense of phosphate and potassium can remain in the soil. I think a lot of certainly here in the U.S. there was a lot of encouragement to test soils before applying those fertilizers in particular. Nitrogen pretty much have to apply one way or the other, and there again we saw some reduction in use. However, on terms of global yields, very small impacts, and I don't think I included the chart where I have one where I looked at all of countries in or all the reporting countries in the FAO database and looked at change in nitrogen use versus change in yields. It's not perfect. There's so much more noise going on, like local weather and other sorts of things, but it does strike you that it looks much like just a big cloud of dots because there's no real uh, uh, decisive relationship that says, oh, yes, you decrease fertilizer use by 2%. Nitrogen use, you're going to see some commensurate drop in yields. Again, as I say, we see a very mixed picture here on crops. I think the difference in 2026 is that in 2022 we did see high output prices. So if you were a farmer and you were looking at high fertilizer prices, but you had pretty high corn prices or pretty high wheat prices or other crops, you'd say, well, I'm still going to apply. The question now with lower prices and with significantly, in some cases, negative returns for producers, whether or not they will cut back with larger reductions than what we saw in 2022, in which case we might begin to see some impacts on both significant impacts on application rates and on ultimately on crop yields. Again, these are big unknowns right now, and it's unclear to what degree that we might be looking at that. And I think it's one reason the markets really haven't factored that potential in right now because they're unsure exactly what ultimately will happen on things like application rates. I might add we don't collect application rates in a timely manner. Maybe at the local level there may be some data points available, but what you will see, the one thing that is visible right now are things like cropping choices. So for countries that report plantings and other things, we're seeing at least preliminary estimates out of the U.S. It looks like more soybeans, which use less fertilizer, will be planted this year than maize. That's not surprising. We saw that a bit of that in 2022 as well. We have an area report coming out of the U.S. at the end of the month, and that should give us a much better notion on plantings. But for some areas of the world, those crop choices just aren't available. And so the real question will be, will one plant as much as they planted last year? And if so, are they going to utilize fertilizer in the same amounts? I think the general feeling is that Northern Hemisphere, among the developed countries, certainly Northern Hemisphere, the fertilizer, a lot of the fertilizer purchases were made prior to the start of the new year. Even a lot of them made last fall. That's a typical buying pattern for in the U.S. and particularly in Europe because of the EU regs on fertilizers that went into effect Jan 1. There was a lot of pre-buying of nitrogen-based fertilizers. But you start moving to other areas of the world, then there are concerns. India is a big importer of fertilizer, big user of fertilizer. They have a very active subsidy program. The government has increased subsidies so that to the fertilizer vendors to ensure that they keep their prices for nitrogen fertilizers and phosphate fertilizers low. But there's a real concern about just availability. They produce a lot of fertilizer, and as I say, a lot of the feedstocks, things like liquefied natural gas, sulfur, other things, they are reporting shortages. I think the general feeling is they probably will have ample fertilizers for the Kharif crop, the major rice crop that's planted. Is being planted now, but the secondary and third crops that often are planted following harvest later in the year, I think that will be very much in jeopardy as we move forward, or at least be less clear. The other big one is Brazil and Southern Hemisphere production. We already know that Australia has cut back on wheat area planted. It looks like they will cut back on wheat plantings this year. At least that's what their major statistical organization, ABARES, is showing. They also have the potential. There's this potential El Nino event that could disrupt production there, and typically in big El Nino years, oftentimes they'll plant less wheat. So those are all factors right now that are bubbling along, and people don't know how they will actually affect world crop conditions. But next slide. I think the last thing I really wanted to tone in on, however, is the thing that we haven't really talked much about, and that's higher energy prices. Because I think that what we are seeing is that with higher energy prices, that of course is raising prices of transportation and shipping, both on oceans, but also for diesel and petrol prices for moving goods from ports to up country, other things, and because of the importance of energy in the global or in the food value chain, both not just the farm level, but also transportation and processing, refrigeration, et cetera, that there's real concern. And that's after a period where we went through, obviously, in 23, 24, with very, very high consumer prices in developed countries and developing countries, and globally, just these really high fertilizer inflation, food price inflation. In some cases, the highest that we've seen since, for a number of regions, since the late 70s even. All of a sudden, this big resurgence of inflation, is potential, and I think that we've seen it with the U.S. CPI. We'll have new CPI numbers shortly, but the food prices have begun to creep up again. I mean, there are some individual commodities that, like beef and tomatoes and other things, that for their own reasons are very high price now. But I think the general inflation in the overall economy is going to have impacts on food price inflation in particular. And I think that's a concern, and certainly is if we're looking at malnutrition and other sorts of things moving forward. Next slide. Yeah, so I'll just close with this. I think my presentation probably may seem overly sanguine in the sense of, the takeaway is that, yeah, we see high input cost for fertilizer and energy, but not so much on food prices. But I do think the inflation thing is a big concern, largely driven by higher energy costs. But again, this is all based on some assumption that we will see a resumption in trade in the Gulf. And I think that there's real concerns that this will last at least through the end of the year now. And, you have certainly some very bad precedents, like closure of the Suez Canal, where it was closed for several years back following the Six-Day War back in the 60s. Into the 70s, this could get worse, I guess, is all I'm trying to say. I am concerned about potential policies like biofuel policies that sound good in the short run for things like energy self-sufficiency or to increase energy availability. But again, the food link is still there. I think it's very important, particularly on the vegetable oil side. We saw back in 2022, for example, at that point, Indonesia had just increased, I think, to the B30. That is 30% of their diesel supply was from biodiesel. That there was one point where the government then put on an export restriction for all palm oil exports. Palm oil is the primary feedstock for biodiesel in Indonesia. It had immediate consequences. I think vegetable oil prices rose overnight by 20%. Export restrictions also tend to get a lot of producers angry at you as well. And there were a lot of demonstrations in Jakarta and other places. And so they relented after 3 weeks and let exports move again. But these are concerns, I think, and we know we've seen that in the past. This link between domestic policies translating into things like export restrictions, and for it's an easy way to make a bad situation far worse. And I've mentioned all the other things, and El Nino, I guess, is still continues to be a potential out there. 2023, we did see some big impacts in Southern Africa. Thankfully, we were lucky to kind of go into 2023 with a very good crop. Prior to that, their stocks in Southern Africa were relatively high, and we came out of El Nino fairly quickly with prospects for a good crop. So the impact. South Africa was able to export a lot to countries like Zimbabwe and other places, and so it wasn't nearly as bad as it might have been. But these are always concerns right now. And with that, I'm way over time. And I was worried I wouldn't have enough to fill the time period.
But no, that's great. And I am mindful of you needing to fix your connection before the next call that I know you're presenting. I think right at 9. So we have about 10 minutes and drop off when you need to. We have Dr. Muchopa on the lines, who's done some work in South Africa on this. I don't know if you can hear us, but any thoughts you have on the energy to food price connection? I know you've published on that recently. And so if you do have.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah, I can hear you. Thanks for the presentation. Nothing much to add. I just was struck by I think there's the last but one slide, and I was just wondering that very sharp drop on the low income economies, the food inflation, and I was trying to figure out what really was going on there. But otherwise,
yeah,
everything, that's very sharp for the low income. This, I don't know, I missed it somehow, or I'm failing
what
to.
I suspect is that, let me just move my clear it up so I can look at the whole thing. I will tell you this: these are the median inflation rates out of the groupings, and I suspect what's happened is towards the end of 2025, you just don't have as many reporting countries, so it may be a bias that we're missing the higher some of the higher inflation countries. I mean, we know certainly if a country like, I didn't talk about anything about food going into the region, right? And so if you look into the Persian Gulf, if you look at Iran has had inflation rates at 80-90% food inflation for the better part of the last few months. They had been at 40%. Their inflation rates had actually come down to 40% per year at the beginning of this year. But it's just it's dramatic, those sorts of things. So yeah, I wouldn't take as much from that. I think my main takeaway is that where a lot of countries did see some drops in food inflation, they are now, I think, going to be headed back up in a lot of areas of the world.
Yeah. And Safia or Otayo might have questions, comments just in the next few minutes. But one thing that you clearly don't have data on, but I'm curious what your impression is, where in this situation, someone has to stop using fertilizer. So, as you said, many Europeans, many people in the United States pre-ordered and will use the same amount. Others might have pre-ordered and then resell or something like that. But where does the demand destruction happen? Governments protect some and keep using despite the loss of supply. So that just concentrates the demand reduction. And just give your impression of where the demand destruction ends up happening.
No, great question, Will. And I should have been very clear that I talked a lot about export restrictions, but the flip side of that are subsidies. And we tend to think of policies like that as being more benign in the sense of protecting domestic producers by shielding them from some of the input things. But indeed, what that means is that for those countries, to the extent that supplies are available, they means the demand for those products is highly inelastic. They'll continue to bring in fertilizer, but that means that with supply curves being fairly inelastic themselves, that means higher and higher prices, particularly regional prices, I think. And that's where you see some of that. So yeah, I think obviously the poor countries in particular, I think where when you add on top of that transportation costs and things like that of getting fertilizer to growing regions within a country, that particularly if it's imported, there's things. And I think in this case, for the heavy dependence on fertilizer means that on the Persian Gulf for a lot of these countries, that also means that they have to find new suppliers. And Russia actually, is what we saw in 2022 is Russia ended up selling a lot. I think South Africa bought a lot from, where that wouldn't have been a big source in the past, at least historically, but it was available. They were able to switch. But here's a case where, again, for countries that are heavily dependent on the Gulf itself, that trying to find those alternative suppliers, they just don't have the resources to flip. Yeah, I've been tracking countries like Thailand and Indonesia. These aren't big exporting countries, but they produce nitrogen and they will sell it if prices are high enough. And so both those countries have increased exports a bit. But again, those are being gobbled up by other economies nearby. And so those, I don't think that those will be getting there. It's a little, I think fertilizer is a little different in that regard than grains, where grains, something like wheat, people will find wheat in from a lot of different sources, and we certainly saw that. I mentioned these export restrictions on rice. For big importing countries on the east side of Africa or West Africa, what you found is that Vietnam and Thailand were supplying those countries in much bigger proportions than before, and a country like Senegal was more or less able to maintain rice. They may have moved from broken rice to a little less broken rice, a little more just to white rice, but generally they were able to do that. Here, and there's a little bit of trade-offs within fertilizers themselves, going from urea, which has a 46% nitrogen, to say ammonium sulfate, which is a little lower. It's a little lower priced, and so I think we'll see some of that. I don't think these are questions, with the exception of I think in some poorer countries it almost is binary, but these are largely countries that aren't where you don't see a lot of fertilizer use anyway. I think in countries that are using a lot of fertilizer, yeah, you'll see some drop off in applications. And again, these curves are, there's a lot of evidence, particularly for countries that are heavily subsidizing, that they may not be the most efficient applications anyway. There may be some gives there, and that's why we don't expect big problems. But again, I suspect there's people on the call here that know far more about what's going on in their own country in terms of input use under all of this.
Yeah. No, we should unfortunately close out, but Nigeria was a country that had exceptionally high reliance on fertilizers from the Middle East, and somebody's going to have to be using millions of tons less,
yeah,
over the coming 12 months, and then 24 months, and perhaps 36 months. And whoever it is who's using those millions of tons less, it might have been misused. And this is an interesting experience where you realize that there may have been overuse or misapplication. And some of it, of course, would come from non-agricultural uses of fertilizer. So, plenty of golf courses around the world are using enormous amounts of nitrogen and would reduce that. But still, I imagine quite a few African fertilizer use opportunities will go unfertilized. with the
Yeah,
resulting.
I agree, Will, and I think the other thing, I mean, again, a lot of it is because of my own particular focus on global prices and things like that, and what the impacts are on they may be less or more muted, but the fact is, if you look at farm income, for example, farm household income in smaller countries that are paying very high input costs for things, that means that farm income is being adversely affected there. They may be planning, they may be getting they may their production may not drop off much, but in fact if you look at overall income, I think that's the real concern. And it's a shame we didn't have James Thurlow on the call, because he's done a little bit of work doing some of the household work with the RIAPA models and looking at what the impacts are on local economies. But again, so much of this I think is going to depend on duration, obviously. But I hope this has been helpful.
Well, thank you so much. Really appreciate it. Again, Joe, you've been just a real, I guess, hero of mine for keeping tabs on these things and communicating really clearly. When we just don't get that connection from the oil and food to fertilizer on a global scale, the way you've been able to show here. So thank you very much.